the ability to look specifically at events. Okay, and so I mentioned this requirement for more information as an interesting event earlier. It's highly variable. It's also something that an insurance provider wouldn't want to do very often. All right, so they would want to limit the amount of times that we're reaching out to a client to ask for more information. That's just because it induces friction from the client perspective. The more times you have to involve them, the more manual it seems. Secondarily, it can also be time consuming because there's no guarantee they get back to you in a timely manner, and so your claim could sit and wait to get that piece of trailing information. The less you would do this, the better. So what you can do is select on this or any event and actually see a distribution as to how often that event is occurring. And this is pretty interesting. This shows us that this requirement for more info could happen up to 4 times. And this distribution shows you, it actually happens more than once, 60% of the time. And as I move this, you start to see how many fall above or below whatever threshold I've chosen. I've also got some interesting stats here, which may be able to allow me to draw correlations. What most commonly is happening prior to this event happening, in case there's any correlation to draw there, or post. And so I've got statistics around those things happening around this event. You also see I can choose to hide it. I can sort by those that have more requirement for more information. I can even align by this event. So let me just show you what that looks like. When I choose to align by this event, we line up all of our timelines as if this event happened at the same time, so we can get a good idea of those things that are happening around it. All right, so some interesting functionality there. What I find most interesting is the ability to use this as a filter and just say, hey, you know what I'm really curious about? Just those claims where we reached out for more info 3 or 4 times. That's a lot, right? And apply that as a filter. And now within my working set, I've got the 1,073 claims where we had 3 or 4 instances of a requirement for more information, and I'm off and running doing my root cause analysis, doing my path analysis to see what the behavior is often it looks like, and so on. Okay. So that's looking at specifically how often are events repeating and what things are happening around them. The last thing we'll touch on is a more granular time form of analysis in our bottleneck tool. All right, so I'll click on Bottleneck. Now this is focused on not your high level overall process durations, but more specifically, where is time being spent at certain transitions within the process. Okay, so let's talk about exactly how we define that. We have the ability to define time a few different ways. We can calculate the time as the amount of time that it takes us to get you from any event to a downstream event. Okay, how long does it take us to get from this stage to the next? On the flip side of that, I can choose to calculate my time based on how much time it took us from any previous event up until that event. All right, so and you'll see the metrics are going to change here because obviously it takes maybe a certain amount of time longer on one side of an event versus another, either pre or post. Or we can have the system group together explicit events for you and show you how long it takes in between certain event pairings. So that's what we'll go through as a part of this example. You've got event transitions here, and this is showing you specifically when these events were followed by one another, were juxtaposed by one another, not when other things were happening in between. It's how many times did we go directly from a first notice of loss to a coverage confirmation, and that's important because we want to look at that as a direct transition and the amount of time spent there. So right now it's sorted based on the number of transitions that any one of these different event pairings has had. Our most common is a first notice of loss to a coverage confirmation. You can go on down the list from there. Okay, and you can see these events paired up. So we can see not only how commonly that occurs, 81% will say of our claims contain this exact transition. That's a lot of them to go from this stage to the next. What's the average time it takes us to get from this step to this step? As a matter of total time taken, how much time have we spent? And then as a percentage, all the time that we've spent processing these claims, how much of it was spent at this step, going from first notice of loss to a coverage confirmation. And so what I find most interesting is just sorting by this metric, because you're going to get high to low a listing of the most time intensive, the most costly stages of the process from a timing perspective, listed out for you straight away, right? And so you can see here 4.63% of the overall claim processing time is spent after a final review until that claim is filed. And from an automation perspective, if you're looking at this from an automation lens, this is a really good stack ranking of being able to prioritize which of these parts of the process you're looking for automation for, because you stand to be able to return the most amount of hours to the business based on the amount of time that we're currently taking. So we look at these and digest exactly what's happening in each portion of this process to be able to understand where our best candidates for automation could be from a time return to the business perspective. And you can see here, not all of these aren't the most common transitions. It's showing you only 99 times we go from a claim in process to a processor assigned, but we spent a lot of time anytime that kind of a sequence happens. Right? And so these are the things we might look to understand more about or weed out of the process.